A gospel that says sin isn't real and salvation doesn't require a crucifixion? Yeah, the early church wanted that one buried, literally. The Gospel of Mary, allegedly written by Mary Magdalene herself, doesn't just challenge church orthodoxy. It flips it on its head. In her version, Jesus doesn't die for your sins because sins are a made-up trap of the mind. There's no hellfire, no divine punishment, and, wait for it, Mary is the one with the secret teachings, not Peter. That's right, the guy who became the first pope gets schooled by a woman in the ancient equivalent of a theological slap fight. This text was considered so dangerous it vanished for over 1,400 years. So how did it survive? And why did it scare the church more than paganism or heresy? Because it wasn't just different, it was personal. And the closer you look, the more you realize. Mary's gospel didn't disappear by accident. It was erased, but not quite completely. Let's dig up what they tried to keep buried. Jesus apparently handed the keys to the kingdom not to Peter, but to Mary Magdalene. That's the opening bombshell of the Gospel of Mary, a mysterious, fragmentary text that the early church worked very hard to forget. In it, Jesus rises from the dead and doesn't high-five his disciples or drop a motivational speech. Instead, he pulls Mary aside and tells her secret teachings. Teachings that include this zinger. Sin isn't real, and people suffer because they're obsessed with the physical world. This wasn't just heresy. This was medieval fire-starter material. The text starts off like a calm post-resurrection meeting. Jesus appears to his disciples and tells them to seek inner peace, not laws or rules. Then he vanishes like a theological mic drop. The disciples freak out, understandably, until Mary calmly steps forward and says, "He told me more. Let me explain." She proceeds to outline a spiritual journey involving 7 levels of enlightenment, soul liberation, and the rejection of fear and desire. Peter's response? Absolute tantrum. He questions why Jesus would confide in a woman over them. Levi has to step in and basically tell Peter to chill. And this, apparently, was the moment the early church said, "Yeah, we're not publishing this one." The document we have is incomplete, ripped and burned. Literally. What survives was discovered in a Cairo market in 1896 in a 5th century codex that had somehow escaped the censorship purge. It's written in Coptic, the language of early Egyptian Christians, but scholars suspect it was originally Greek. And here's where it gets even weirder. This gospel doesn't actually portray Jesus dying for sins. There's no mention of crucifixion, no blood sacrifice. Instead, the path to salvation is purely internal. Liberation comes not through obedience or penance, but by escaping ignorance, which, from the church's point of view, is about as helpful as teaching a peasant to read and then handing them a match. This gospel was likely written in the 2nd century CE, early enough to make it part of the Christian conversation, but just late enough to fall outside the carefully controlled canon of texts the church eventually approved. It belongs to a genre known as Gnostic, which basically means mystical rebel philosophy with a serious disdain for organized religion. Gnostics believed the material world was a trap, created by a lower deity, basically a cosmic bureaucrat. Salvation, they argued, came from gnosis, or hidden knowledge. And who better to deliver that knowledge than Mary, the woman the canonical Gospels only hint was important? Let's pause there. By the 2nd century, Mary Magdalene had already been downgraded from apostle to the apostles to repentant prostitute, despite zero biblical evidence for that job title. It wasn't until Pope Gregory I in the 6th century that this smear campaign became official. So the idea of Mary being not just spiritually significant, but actually the keeper of secret wisdom? Absolutely radioactive. The Gospel of Mary doesn't just tweak theology, it rewrites the power structure. In this version, Peter, the supposed rock of the church, is jealous, insecure, and spiritually inferior. That's not just revisionist. That's a direct challenge to apostolic authority. And it wasn't alone. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, these were all floating around in early Christianity like theological landmines. Each offered a radically different take on who Jesus was and what his message meant. But Mary's Gospel stood out because it offered something more than ideology. It offered a power struggle. This wasn't just spiritual rebellion, it was political. Now, let's talk about why this matters. Most people think the Bible was this neat package dropped from heaven. In reality, the process of choosing the canonical Gospels took centuries. It involved councils, emperors, and a lot of burned manuscripts. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE didn't even decide which books were official. It just tried to get everyone to agree Jesus was divine. The actual canon wasn't nailed down until the late 4th century. By that time, anything too mystical, too Gnostic, or too female-centered had been thoroughly scrubbed. The Gospel of Mary didn't survive because it was preserved. It survived because someone hid it. Someone copied it by hand, tucked it away in the desert sands of Egypt, and probably prayed it would be found by someone who wouldn't burn it again. That someone turned out to be a 19th century German scholar who stumbled upon it in a Cairo antiquities market, possibly between buying a coffee pot and avoiding pickpockets. But wait, it gets messier. Only about 10 pages of the Gospel of Mary survive. The rest? Gone. Torn out, likely destroyed centuries earlier. What remains hints at a much larger text, a deeper theology, a lost tradition. Scholars argue over whether Mary Magdalene actually wrote it. Spoiler, she didn't. Like most ancient Gospels, it was probably written by her followers, or someone using her name to lend authority. That was common back then. Everyone did it. It's like ancient fan fiction, except with eternal consequences. But whether or not she penned it herself, the message is clear. Early Christianity was not one story. It was a brutal, chaotic battle of ideas, and the winners rewrote history. We remember Peter as the first pope, but in at least one vision of Christian origins, Peter was the guy who couldn't handle a woman knowing more than him. And here's the kicker. The teachings in the Gospel of Mary sound oddly modern. Personal empowerment, inner peace, detachment from materialism. It reads less like a dusty relic and more like the kind of thing you'd find on a motivational poster, minus the cross. One surviving fragment even includes Mary saying that fear and suffering are caused by attachment to the body. Jesus tells her that the mind is the key to freedom. There's no mention of sin, hell, or eternal punishment. Just ignorance and knowledge, pain and liberation. Which, if you were building an institution based on sin and salvation, would be incredibly inconvenient. So what happened to Mary Magdalene? In official church history, she became a penitent sinner, weeping at Jesus' feet. But in the Gnostic world, she was something else entirely. A spiritual equal, a teacher, a witness, and maybe even more than that. Some Gnostic texts describe her as Jesus' closest companion. The Gospel of Philip goes further, suggesting they were romantically involved. Though, to be clear, this could just be symbolic language taken too literally by modern readers hungry for scandal. Still, the idea of Jesus sharing intimate spiritual knowledge with a woman, and her passing it on to others, was more than the early church could handle. Patriarchy and mysticism have never gotten along. Add in some jealousy and institutional paranoia, and you've got a recipe for erasure. And yet, Mary's voice refused to disappear. Her gospel survived wars, purges, and time itself. What's left is fragmentary, yes, but its message is crystal clear. There was a time when Christian belief wasn't just one path. It was a maze. And at least one exit had Mary's name on it. Makes you wonder what else got cut.